Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And still I rise, Mr. Speaker. I rise with a message related to the month. This is indeed Black History Month. But I rise with a message that goes far beyond this month. A message that carries with it a moral imperative to do certain things that are on the conscious agenda. So today I will first thank the leadership for allowing me to have this time, this privilege to come to the floor and speak on these issues. I'm grateful to the leadership on both sides of the aisle. I'm grateful because it is a rare privilege that one is accorded when one can stand in the well of the Congress and literally speak to the world. Each time I do it, Mr. Speaker, I ask myself, could you have ever imagined this happening to you? And the answer is always the same: never. So I don't take for granted this privilege that I have. And I'm honored to stand here and represent the 9th Congressional District of Texas. But as a U.S. Congressman, a United States Congressman, I do represent everyone in the country because my votes impact the entirety of the nation. So today, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk about several issues that are our moral imperative. These issues will include, first, August 20th as an annual day wherein we will recognize slavery remembrance. We want to inculcate this into the fiber and fabric of our country. Slavery Remembrance Day is important because it is unlike any other day. There are many holidays in this country, and I recognize them. I have no quarrel with them. But in this country, we have certain days that are set aside for us to remember certain events that have been seminal moments in time. 9/11, a seminal moment in time, a day to be remembered. Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, a seminal moment in time, a day to be remembered. The Holocaust, a seminal moment in time that has impacted the rest of time, should be remembered. All of these are remembrance days, days that we have set aside in this country to remember. Well, August 20th of 1619, the White Lion landed, docked, if you will, at Point Comfort. And the White Lion had on it 20 persons of African ancestry, 20 people who were traded. They traded cargo. They had other things that were desired by the colonies, the colonists, and they traded, they exchanged these things. But they also had 20 people that were exchanged for goods that they desired. These 20 people became the persons that we know as slaves who were among the first, if not the first, in this country. There may be some debate about some other circumstance, but generally speaking, August 20th, 1619 is acknowledged as the date that slavery had its ugly face shown in our country. August 20th, 1619. 20 people, human beings, treated like cattle, called chattels. Treated like cattle, called chattels. Chattel slavery. We want to commemorate their lives and all of the millions of lives that followed. Commemorate their lives and commemorate their contributions to the success of this country. America's a great country, but it's great because of these humble hands. There were others who contributed to the greatness, and they've been acknowledged, and many are going to be acknowledged. But the humble hands of slaves have not been properly acknowledged for what they have done to make America the great nation that it is. These humble hands helped to construct this Capitol. They helped to raise the Statue of Freedom that is on top of the Capitol. These humble hands helped to build roads and bridges. They planted the crops. They harvested. They literally were the means by which the nation was fed. These persons were worked, some of them for their entire lives, without remuneration, without compensation. They were kept alive. They were given clothing. They were given food, the necessities of life, only such that many of them could continue to slave their lives away. We don't recognize them for what they've done for this country. The truth is, we revile them. We revile the slaves, those who were enslaved, to be more appropriate. We revile them and we revere the enslavers. Confederate soldiers have been revered across the length and breadth of this country. Confederate soldiers who fought to maintain slavery have been honored and celebrated and appreciated. Confederate soldiers who took the lives of many people, many of whom were not slaves, in the Civil War. Confederate soldiers have been honored, celebrated, and appreciated, but not so with the enslaved persons who are the foundational mothers and fathers and children of this country. They haven't been properly recognized. I mentioned that the Confederate soldiers have been lionized by having their names placed on schools, statues around the country. There's no statue honoring Nat Turner. No statue that I know of. There may be one or two someplace that's unknown to me. But those who fought to liberate the slaves have been demonized. I remember well what I was taught when I was in grade school, how Nat Turner was a bad man. Nat Turner was a liberator. How John Brown was crazy. He was a white man who was a liberator. We've been taught to demonize the liberators, lionize those who would maintain slavery, and literally overlook, marginalize, literally try as best as we can to reshape history as it relates to those who were enslaved. Here's how far we've gone with this. 1956. This Congress, 1956, the Congress of the United States of America accorded a Congressional Gold Medal to Confederate soldiers. Confederate soldiers. The Congress of the United States of America honored Confederate soldiers. Never has this Congress bestowed any honor on the enslaved. It is almost impossible for people of goodwill to comprehend that such a thing occurred. And it's still occurring because we still have places around the country where Confederate soldiers are being lionized. But the slaves, they've not been recognized. No recognition, appreciable recognition for the slaves, the people who helped build the country, foundational mothers and fathers of the country, born into slavery. Babies were slaves for edification purposes. Babies were slaves. If you were born the child of a slave, you were a slave at birth. You lived your entire life as a slave. You died as a slave. At some point, this wrong has to be addressed. I believe that it should be addressed by according the slaves, the persons who were enslaved. They didn't place themselves in this condition. I believe that it should be addressed by according them a Congressional Gold Medal, just as we accorded the Confederate soldiers who sought to maintain slavery a Congressional Gold Medal. That's not asking too much of the country. In this Congress, we're going to give Congressional Gold Medals to people. Yes. Last Congress we did. Why can't we give a Congressional Gold Medal to those who were enslaved? Oh, because that happened centuries ago. Because they are no longer with us. Well, we have accorded Congressional Gold Medals posthumously. This would not be the first time. We've done it. The Code Talkers, Tuskegee Airmen, the soldiers who died in Afghanistan. We've done it. The question is, do we have the decency to do for the people who helped build this country what we've done for so many others? Just the decency. I believe that we can and we should do this. It would be historic, but it would be meaningful to a good many people. It would say that we respect those people. We regret what happened to them, but we respect them, and we respect them enough to recognize their lives, not just the work, not the building of the country, but their lives that were sacrificed. I believe it can be done. I believe it should be done. But I'm not alone in my belief. We opened the letter up and started circulating it today. I want to read the names of the persons who have similar beliefs. These are persons who are already on as original co-sponsors, and we will close the opportunity at the end of Black History Month. It is open now to everyone. This is Black History Month. This is a piece of black history, a seminal piece of black history. And we're going to tell you who believes that a Congressional Gold Medal ought to be accorded. Persons who sacrificed, whose lives were sacrificed to make America the great country it is. The Honorable Maxine Waters, first on the list. The Honorable Benny Thompson. The Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee. The Honorable Danny Davis. The Honorable Jim McGovern. For fear that someone may just be tuning in or starting to follow what we're doing, I'm announcing the names of persons who have allowed their names to be associated with the Congressional Gold Medal legislation that we will be filing at the end of this month, this Black History Month. I will continue with the names. The Honorable Brad Sherman, the Honorable Barbara Lee, the Honorable Emmanuel Cleaver, the Honorable Yvette Clarke, the Honorable Hank Johnson, the Honorable Jerry Connolly, the Honorable Kwasi Mfume, the Honorable David Cicilline, the Honorable Joaquin Castro, the Honorable Mark Veazey, the Honorable Pete Aguilar, the Honorable Ted Lieu, the Honorable Adriano Espaillat, the Honorable Colin Allred, the Honorable Lizzie Fletcher, the Honorable Sylvia Garcia, the Honorable Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Honorable Ilhan Omar, the Honorable Ayanna Pressley, the Honorable Troy Carter, the Honorable Greg Cesar, the Honorable Jasmine Crockett, the Honorable Bonnie Watson Coleman. I trust that there will be more names that I will be permitted to announce at a future point in time. Remember, historic legislation, original co-sponsorship closes at the end of Black History Month. The last day, it will close at the end of this month. This legislation is designed to be brought to the attention of the House this month. So we will close it and we will file it on the last day of this month. I believe that should we do this, and we should, if we do this, I believe that it will make a difference in the lives of all people in this country. Because I think that in large part, the reason we had a person of African ancestry assaulted by other persons of African ancestry who are part of the constabulary, police officers, it's because there is little respect for black lives. Not as much respect for black lives. We say all lives matter. If we say that, then we've got to say Black Lives Matter. You can't say all lives matter and not say Black Lives Matter. They do. I do not believe that if that young man had been of European ancestry, what we would call an Anglo or white, whichever you prefer. I quite frankly don't like saying white. But if he had been an Anglo, a person of European ancestry, those officers wouldn't have behaved that way. They would not have disrespected his life to the extent that they disrespected that young man of African ancestry's life. We've got to respect black lives. If you say they matter, then you respect them. And for edification purposes, further edification, this is not the first time. And if anybody thinks it's the last, you're mistaken. I want it to be the last. I don't want it to ever occur again, but it can and likely will. Because we don't respect black lives to the same extent as many others, and we should. This will go a long way towards saying to the world, black lives are to be respected. I believe that black lives, when properly respected, will not be abused, as was the case with that young man. What they did to him is unthinkable. I would say unforgivable, but my religious teachings don't allow me to say that. I would say it. But we forgive according to my religiosity. We forgive. But I assure you, it's the kind of thing you never forget. I have memory for a reason, to remember so that I can shape the future. Black lives do matter, and I would like to think that we can pass this first thing on our list, on this conscious agenda, the inculcating of August 20th annually as Slavery Remembrance Day. I'm going to move on to the next item on the list. All of these items are important. Some would say are more important than the others, but they're all important. And by the way, there are many more things that will be added to this list. This is not exhaustive of the things that are our moral imperative for this conscious agenda. The second item that I have listed, third item actually, I've talked about the August 20th as Slavery Remembrance Day, and I've talked about awarding a Congressional Gold Medal to the enslaved. So now I'm going to talk about the third item, which is the name of Richard Russell, removing the name of Richard Russell from the Russell Senate Office Building. Richard Russell was a self-proclaimed white supremacist. I don't go in the Russell Senate Office Building. I think I respect myself enough not to go in the Russell Senate Office Building. Others do what they may. And I assure you, if that office building had on it a name associated with the Third Reich, lots of other people wouldn't go in too. We'd take that name off of that building. What Richard Russell did to people of color is not only sinful, it is such shameful, so shameful as to not reward him with placing his name on a building paid for with tax dollars, maintained with tax dollars, knowing that people of color of necessity have to go in and out of the building? Do you have no respect for us? Do you not care how we feel about things? Is it just another thing that we'll get around to when we feel like it? Can we not say when things that are harmful to us, our psyche, our well-being, can we not say when they should cease to exist? Do you have to always set the timetable for the people who suffer? What's wrong with the Senate? The United States Senate can change this. Take his name off. Richard Russell fought anti-lynching legislation. Richard Russell was the father of the Southern Manifesto. Man called himself a white supremacist. What is wrong with us? Why do we disrespect black people to this extent? The Senate ought to immediately take it up, but it won't. This is Black History Month. Be a great time to do it, but it won't. There are people hiding behind, well, who do we name it after? Who do we honor? What name do you put on it? I'm not asking you to put Nat Turner's name on it. I'm not asking you to put John Brown's name on it. I'm not asking you to put Dr. King's name on it, Rosa Parks' name on it, Harriet Tubman's. I'm not asking you to put any name on it other than the name it had before it became the Russell Senate Office Building. And that name was the old Senate Office Building. Revert to the name it had, and then take all of the time you desire, my dear brothers and sisters. Take as much time as God allows. Ad infinitum. Go beyond the end of time if you so desire. But Richard Russell's name won't be there ad infinitum. It won't be there beyond the end of time. We will have done more than the right thing. You can do the right thing. That would be a part of it. But we will do more than the right thing if we take his name off. We will have done the righteous thing. The righteous thing. His name ought not be there. Richard Russell, notorious bigot, notorious white supremacist. His name ought not be on that building. And at some point in time, some point along this infinite continuum that we call time, we are going to have to account for our time. And those of you who have it within your power to change these things, you're going to have to account for your time. At some point on the infinite continuum, you will account for it. You will account for holding in your hands the ability to make righteous change and deciding that you'll do it when you get good and ready and when it benefits you. You ought to be concerned about the people adversely impacted and how it will benefit them as opposed to how it will benefit you. Minister talked about the Good Samaritan today. The Good Samaritan didn't ask the question, what will happen to me if I cross over and I help this person who's been beset upon by thieves? That wasn't the question. The Good Samaritan wanted to know, what will happen to him if I don't do it? Senate of the United States of America, ask what will happen to the many people who have to suffer knowing that there's a racist name on a Senate office building that's paid for with their tax dollars. If the tables were turned and he insulted European Anglos to the same extent that he has insulted black people, his name wouldn't be there. They would have removed it long ago. It's time for the name to come off of the building. Let it revert to the old Senate office building. The fourth thing on the agenda, fourth, enacting the Securities and Exchange Atonement Act. Friends, our research has shown that financial institutions engaged in the slave trade, banks, many of the big banks now had predecessor institutions, banks, that literally, actually made loans to people and allowed those loans to be secured with enslaved people. Enslaved people treated like cattle called chattels. Enslaved people like a piece of property. Like you secure a loan now with a piece of property. They secured the loans with enslaved people. Made money doing it. Insurance companies, predecessor institutions, literally insured enslaved people just as you would insure cattle, a horse, a cow. They insured them, made money. They need to atone. They need to atone. Atonement has not been defined in the sense of do a specific thing. One institution has made an effort, but there has to be atonement. There has to be some sort of atonement for that. I assure you, if the tables were turned, and if Anglos have been treated in the numbers and the same way, similar fashion to the way people of color were treated, Anglos would be demanding atonement. I assure you, it's not even debatable. You would. You would. And by the way, I'd be there with you. I would stand with you because it would be the righteous thing to do. I would stand with you if the tables were turned on any of these issues because it would be the righteous thing to do. And I plan to proceed with this legislation. We will be filing it in this Congress. And finally, establishing the Department of Reconciliation. We've not reconciled in this country. And by the way, I'm of the opinion that there are many people who just don't care. They don't care. But there are many others who do. Who do. And those who care, people of goodwill, they know that we need to do more to reconcile. We need to cover this moral imperative. We have a Department of Education with undersecretaries of education, a Department of Labor, undersecretaries of labor, Department of Commerce. Why then can we not have a department of reconciliation? A Department of Reconciliation with a Secretary of Reconciliation and undersecretaries, structured such that it will deal with the moral imperatives. A Department of Reconciliation such that at the end of the day, when one president leaves office and another comes in, the work of the department continues. Just as the Department of Labor continues, the Department of Commerce continues, One president coming and leaving does not change the work of any of these departments. It's not going to be easy to complete the moral imperative, the conscious agenda. It's not going to be easy, but it's something that we must do. We're not going to change history. Those who desire to no longer teach what actually happened to people in this country. There are people in Texas now who would have slavery become involuntary relocation. That's true. Involuntary relocation. Kidnapping, involuntary relocation. Murder, rape, involuntary relocation. Separating families at the auction block, involuntary relocation. No, you're not going to change history. You're not. There are people who want to, under some specious theory that the people who want to teach history are somehow wanting to harm the country by telling the truth. Now, we are a country that believes in truth. We preach truth in this country. Somewhere it's written, ye shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. Truth, there's a certain amount of freedom associated with actualizing, realizing the truth. So we have to know the truth. You're not going to be able to hide it. But there are people who would say that by teaching truth, we're going to harm the country. What about the people who suffered and still suffer as a result of the truth not being told? People have to know what happened. Black History Month is not nearly enough time to explain what happened. We pick out certain things that happened, certain meaningful moments in time, but that's not Black history. Black history is more than the civil rights movement. It really is. It's more than the history of Africans in the Americas. Yes, Black history is American history, but it's also world history. It's world history. Just as the history of others who are global, they have a global history too. I remember in my history book, there was an indication that the reason the nations or countries in Africa were not mentioned in world history was because they made little contribution to history. I had to grow up with that. Little contributions to history. Yeah. Friends, and I say friends, and I'm very sincere when I say it. I consider people friends who may not consider me a friend. But friends, or as Dr. King might say it, brothers and sisters, we must reconcile. We will not reconcile without some structured department, something that has no end in sight. The end would be when reconciliation is ultimately achieved. So we need this Department of Reconciliation. The country needs it. It will benefit us all. It will make the country a better place. But not everybody wants it. Not everybody wants to see the change in the status quo. I know this is a very difficult thing for many people to embrace. And I'm very much aware of what Voltaire called to our attention. And it impacts many people. He reminded us that it is dangerous to be right in affairs where established men are wrong. It's dangerous to be right. Many people, they understand that. And because they understand that, they avoid this. This is a righteous agenda. There is nothing on here that cannot be done and should not be done. Everything on here is a part of the righteous agenda. Nothing wrong with inculcating August 20th as Slavery Remembrance Day because of what happened to the slaves, just as we have a 9/11 remembrance, just as we have a Pearl Harbor remembrance, a Holocaust remembrance. By the way, all recognized by the Congress. That would be the House and the Senate. Congress as House and the Senate, not just the House. All recognized. But I do confess this, and I should have mentioned it earlier, but it's never too late to speak truth. The President of the United States has acknowledged August 20th, has acknowledged Slavery Remembrance Day. The Honorable Joe Biden. The House passed this resolution, by the way, many members are not aware of it. We did pass a resolution honoring August 20th. I don't know what the Senate will do, but I'm at a point where I just believe we need to go on and commemorate the day. Just commemorate the day. That nobody gets paid. I'm not asking, does anybody get paid? Nobody should be paid. This is a day of commemoration, not celebration. No celebrations. I don't want the stores to give discounts, Slavery Remembrance Day discounts. That's not what this is about. This is sacred. This is not secular. This is August the 20th. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it. The President has acknowledged, and if I just may say so, the President, in his efforts to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter and do so in a very positive way, the President appointed an African-American female to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Something that could have been done by many others, but never achieved. He did it. Now, if anybody thinks I'm going to forget that the President did something as significant as that, see, may not be important to other people, but to me it is. Probably one of the most important things that he has done. And I'll be eternally grateful, and there are a lot of other people who will be equally as grateful. So there's nothing wrong with this August 20th as Slavery Remembrance Day. Nothing wrong with giving a congressional gold medal to the enslaved people who built the country, laid the foundation for the economic success of the country. Nothing wrong with that. If we can do it for the Confederate soldiers, surely we can do it for the enslaved people born into slavery, lived as slaves, many of them, and died as slaves. Nothing wrong with removing the name of a self-proclaimed white supremacist from a building paid for with tax dollars. Nothing wrong with saying that these companies, mega companies, nothing wrong with saying that these mega companies who profited enormously from the slave trade, nothing wrong with saying they should atone. Good Christians understand atonement. People of goodwill understand atonement. All religions address atonement in some way. Nothing wrong with atonement. And wanting to reconcile, having a Department of Reconciliation. How does that hurt a country wherein we see circumstances necessitating reconciliation? our moral imperative. Mr. Speaker, it's always an honor. It is a privilege to have this freedom of speech. Freedom of speech may be the hallmark of our democracy. We don't have to agree. That's what freedom of speech is all about. Freedom to say and not be persecuted for having said. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to speak without fear of persecution. I could be wrong, but I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. And I'm grateful. I love my country. I try to conclude by saying this. I love my country. I salute the flag. Yes, I say the Pledge of Allegiance. I sing the national anthem. I stand when I sing it. I place my hand on my heart when I sing it. I place my hand on my heart when I say the Pledge of Allegiance. But I also defend those who choose not to. That's the greatness of America. The greatness of America is not in my standing and saluting and singing. The greatness is in allowing those who choose not to. That's the greatness of the country, that we can accept those who would not do what others do. Those who would say, look, I'm not an automaton. I'm not going to march in lockstep. I choose to take a different path. I defend their right to do so. I do so because I love my country. God bless you, Mr. Speaker. God bless the United States of America.